Hello, dear friends. I hope you're doing well today. I never thought I'd be here, telling you this story. If you had met me years ago, I was a completely different person. Devout, confident in my faith, certain that I had all the answers. But something happened to me, something that shattered everything I thought I knew and changed my life forever. I didn't expect it. I wasn't looking for it. But it found me. My name is David Carter, and I was raised in a deeply religious Muslim household. Faith wasn't just a part of my life, it was the foundation of everything I did. From childhood, I was taught discipline, devotion, and obedience. 5 times a day, I bowed in prayer, whispering the verses of the Quran with unwavering reverence. The mosque, I was proud of my devotion. I truly believed that my commitment to God, my endless prayers, my fasting, my unwavering adherence to Islamic teachings, would one day lead me to salvation. My life had a structure, a rhythm, and a sense of certainty that I clung to. But deep inside, something unsettled me. Late at night, when the world was silent, questions would creep into my mind. What if I hadn't done enough? What if, despite all my prayers, all my efforts, my sins still outweighed my good deeds? I was taught that my salvation depended on a divine scale, that if my good deeds outbalanced my bad ones, I would earn paradise. But what if I failed? What if, in the end, it wasn't enough? I tried to bury those fears, convincing myself that my devotion was stronger than my doubts. Whenever uncertainty crept in, I drowned it out with more prayer, more study, more faith. I had always respected other religions, but I firmly believed that Christianity was misguided. The idea that Jesus could be the Son of God seemed absurd to me. Jesus was a prophet, a great prophet, but still just a man. The Trinity made no sense, and the idea of salvation through grace alone felt like a shortcut, one that ignored the necessity of effort and personal responsibility. I carried this conviction with me for years. Whenever I met Christians, I debated with them, confidently refuting their beliefs with the Quran. I prided myself on my knowledge and my ability to dismantle their arguments. But beneath my certainty, the quiet doubts remained. Then, everything changed. It started as an ordinary day, a visit with my younger brother, an afternoon spent discussing theology in Chicago. But by nightfall, a dull pressure in my chest turned into something far more severe. At first, I dismissed it as heartburn. By the time my brother realized something was wrong, I could barely breathe. "David, we need to get you to the hospital," he said, reaching for his keys. I waved him off. "It's fine," I insisted. "Probably just something I ate." But it wasn't. Minutes later, I collapsed. My vision blurred. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. I was dying. And the last thing I remember was my brother's voice, frantic, filled with urgency, as he called my name. His hands gripped my shoulders, shaking me, but I couldn't respond. The world around me had begun to fade, the fluorescent lights of the hospital blurring into a haze. My chest burned with an unbearable pressure, as if something heavy was crushing me from the inside out. I wanted to speak. I wanted to tell him I was okay, that this was just temporary, that I would push through it like I always did. But I couldn't. The pain in my chest deepened, spreading like wildfire through my limbs. My vision dimmed. The voices of the doctors and nurses, once sharp and hurried, became distant echoes, blending into an indistinguishable hum. I was slipping away. I had always believed I was prepared for death. I had spent my life praying, fasting, studying scripture, doing everything I thought was necessary to stand before God. But in that moment, with the reality of my mortality pressing down on me, an overwhelming fear gripped my soul. Was this it? Had I done enough? Had I lived righteously? Had my good deeds truly outweighed my sins? Panic swelled in my chest, worse than the physical pain. I had always clung to the belief that my prayers, my devotion, my discipline would secure my place in paradise. But as the darkness crept in, doubt clawed at my mind like a Shah. What if I was wrong? What if I had misunderstood everything? No, I couldn't think like that. This was just a test, a trial to prove my faith. I forced myself to whisper the Shahada, the declaration of faith, over and over, my lips barely moving. La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. God is one. Muhammad is his prophet. I had said these words thousands of times before, but now they felt empty, like I was grasping at something just out of reach, something slipping through my fingers no matter how tightly I tried to hold on. Darkness overtook me. For a moment, there was nothing. No pain, no sound, no light, just silence. And then, something changed. I wasn't in my body anymore. I was floating. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, some strange byproduct of the medications or the trauma my body was experiencing. But then I looked down, and I saw myself, lying there, motionless on the hospital bed, tubes and wires running across my chest, machines beeping erratically. My face was pale, my breathing shallow, my body a mere shell, fragile, vulnerable, insignificant. My brother stood in the corner, his hands gripping the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. His face was etched with fear, his lips pressed together as if he was trying to hold back a prayer. I wanted to call out to him. I wanted to tell him I was still here, that I wasn't gone. But I couldn't. I had no voice. I had no form. I wasn't bound by the weight of my body, and yet I existed. A strange calmness settled over me. There was no more fear, no more pain. I was weightless, suspended in a space between life and death. And that's when I saw it, a light. The light was unlike anything I had ever known. It wasn't just bright, it was alive. It pulsed gently, radiating a warmth that reached deep into the core of whatever I had become. It wasn't harsh or blinding, yet it carried an intensity that made everything else fade into insignificance. I felt it pulling me, not with force, but with an irresistible presence, as though it was calling out to something buried deep within me. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to resist, to cling to the reality I had always known, the life I had just left behind. But another part of me, one I couldn't quite understand, was drawn to it. The fear that had gripped me moments ago was gone. The pain, the uncertainty, the weight of all my doubts, they had dissolved into nothingness. For the first time in my life, I felt weightless, untethered from the burdens that had defined me. I turned my gaze back toward the hospital room. I could still see my body lying on the bed, surrounded by frantic doctors and nurses. The heart monitor beeped erratically. My brother stood frozen in shock, his face drained of color. Everything about that scene felt distant now, like a story I had once been a part of but no longer belonged to. I should have felt panic, desperation, a desperate need to return. But I didn't. Instead, I was overwhelmed by something else. Peace. Not just the absence of fear, but something deeper. A peace that filled every part of me. A peace that felt whole, complete, eternal. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced, even in my most fervent prayers or moments of spiritual clarity. I had spent my entire life seeking this feeling, through discipline, through devotion, through an unwavering commitment to faith. But now, here, suspended in this moment between existence and eternity, I was encountering something beyond anything I had ever imagined. And then I heard it, a voice. It wasn't loud. yet it reverberated through me with undeniable power. It wasn't coming from the light itself, yet it seemed woven into its very essence. It was neither harsh nor demanding, but filled with an authority that left no room for doubt. Come, just one word, yet it carried everything. An invitation, a promise, a truth that seemed to pierce through every layer of my being. My hesitation melted away. I no longer questioned where I was or what was happening. I only knew that I had to move forward. As I moved deeper into the light, the world I had known faded entirely. There was no more hospital room, no more frantic doctors, no more beeping machines. Even the image of my brother, frozen in fear, disappeared from my mind. I was somewhere else now, somewhere beyond time, beyond space, beyond anything I had ever imagined. The warmth of the light wasn't just external. It filled me from within, wrapping around me like an embrace. It wasn't the warmth of the sun or the heat of fire. It was something more. A presence, a force, a love so overwhelming that it left no room for fear. For the first time in my life, I wasn't striving. I wasn't trying to prove myself, wasn't measuring my deeds, wasn't weighed down by the pressure of earning my place before God. I simply existed, fully known, fully seen, fully accepted. And then I saw him. At first, he was just a silhouette within the radiance, a figure emerging from the brilliance of the light itself. But as he stepped forward, the details became clear. His presence was unlike anything I had ever encountered. Majestic, yet deeply personal. Powerful, yet full of gentleness. There was no mistaking who he was. Even before he spoke, I knew. Jesus. Every part of me tensed, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. This isn't possible. I had studied Christianity. I had debated Christians. I had always believed that Jesus was just a prophet, respected, yes, but a man like any other, not divine. Not the Son of God. The idea had always seemed impossible. Yet here he was. He looked at me, and in that instant, every thought, every argument, every doubt unraveled. His eyes weren't just looking at me, they were looking into me, not with condemnation, not with judgment, but with an understanding so deep, it pierced my soul. He knew me, all of me, every thought I had ever had, every fear I had buried, every moment of doubt I had ignored. And still, he loved me. I wanted to speak, to question, to resist. But before I could, he did something that shattered every wall I had built inside myself. He smiled. Not a smile of triumph, not a smile of correction, but one of patience, kindness, and invitation. It was a smile that told me he had been waiting for me, not just in this moment, but my entire life. I stood there, suspended in the brilliance of the light, unable to move, unable to speak. Jesus' presence was overwhelming, not in a way that crushed me, but in a way that made every defense I had ever built crumble into nothing. His gaze held me in place, not with force, but with something far more powerful, truth. It was as if every lie I had ever believed, every assumption I had ever clung to, was now exposed under the weight of his eyes. He had called me by name, David, not with accusation, not with rebuke, but with an understanding so deep that I felt completely seen. No one had ever looked at me like this before. Not my parents, not my teachers, not even myself. His words still echoed inside me. You have many questions, and I am here to give you the answers. I wanted to speak, to form a response, but my thoughts were tangled, my emotions a storm I couldn't control. For so long, I had prided myself on my knowledge, on my ability to debate, to argue, to prove others wrong. And yet, here I was, standing before the very one I had dismissed my entire life, and for the first time, I had nothing to say, Jesus took another step closer, and the radiance around him pulsed. Not with intensity, but with warmth. It wasn't just light. It was life. And somehow I knew I was in the presence of something far greater than myself, something far greater than anything I had ever studied or defended. And then the visions began. Without warning, the light around us shifted. The endless brilliance gave way to something new. Scenes, moving like living memories unfolding before my eyes. At first, they were familiar. Stories I had read, passages from the Quran about Jesus, the ones I had studied, memorized, recited in debates. I saw him healing the sick, giving sight to the blind, raising the dead with just a word. These were stories I had always accepted as truth. But now, seeing them with his touch was unlike any other. It didn't just heal wounds, it restored wholeness. His words life itself. And awe, reverence, love. Then, I saw things I had never studied before. Moments I had dismissed, stories I had ignored. I saw him at the Last Supper, speaking with his disciples, a sorrow in his eyes that felt unbearable. I saw him in the garden, praying alone, his agony deep and real. I saw his betrayal, his arrest, the trial, the beating, the cross. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The nails, the crown of thorns, the weight of the world pressing down on him. Why? I turned toward him, my voice barely a whisper. Why did you do this? His words cut through me like a blade, yet they carried no sharpness, no accusation, only love. For you. I had spent my entire life believing that salvation was something to be earned, something weighed out in a balance of deeds. Yet here stood Jesus, telling me that he had taken my place, that he had endured this unimaginable suffering for me. Not because I had done enough to deserve it, but because I never could. The scenes continued to unfold before my eyes, vivid and unrelenting. I saw the cross in all its horror, not as a symbol, not as a theological argument, but as reality. Blood streamed from his wounds. His body, broken beyond recognition, trembled with pain. The weight of it pressed down on me, suffocating, unbearable. I wanted to turn away. I wanted to reject it, but the truth wouldn't let me. Then I heard his voice again. Not in the past, not in the vision, but here, standing beside me. I did this so that you would not have to carry the burden of your own salvation. Tears burned in my eyes, but I forced myself to speak. My voice trembled as I whispered, but I was taught, I believed that our deeds determined our eternity. Jesus' eyes held mine, filled with patience, with understanding. If that were true, no one would enter heaven. No one can be perfect. No one can live without sin. But I made a way, David. Through me, through my sacrifice, you are free. I shook my head, struggling to comprehend. Free. Free from the weight of striving, from the fear of never being enough, from the doubt that has haunted you since you were a child. He stepped closer, and as he did, the crushing weight inside me, the guilt, the uncertainty, the endless question of whether I had done enough, began to lift. It was as if he had reached inside me and taken the burden upon himself. And in that moment I understood. This wasn't about what I had done. It was about what he had done. This wasn't about me earning salvation. It was about me accepting it. I fell to my knees, not out of obligation, not out of ritual, but because I was overwhelmed by grace. For the first time in my life, I saw myself as I truly was, flawed, broken, incapable of saving myself. And yet, standing before Jesus, I was loved beyond comprehension. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered, I don't deserve this. Jesus knelt beside me, his voice steady, unwavering. You never could. That's why it's a gift. I closed my eyes, letting his words sink deep into my soul. Everything I had ever believed, everything I had ever lived for, had been turned upside down. And yet, for the first time, I felt whole. I knelt there in the overwhelming presence of Jesus, my mind spinning, my heart trembling under the weight of what I had just realized. Every belief I had clung to, every argument I had ever made, every assurance I had given myself about my own righteousness, it all felt so small now, so fragile, so wrong. I had spent my entire life striving, performing, trying to prove that I was worthy. I had measured my deeds, recited my prayers, and disciplined myself with unwavering devotion, believing that salvation had to be earned, that I had to be enough. But here, in the light of his presence, all of that striving felt meaningless. And yet I was not condemned. I was loved. Jesus remained kneeling before me, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. There was no anger, no disappointment, no rebuke, only understanding, only patience. He had waited for me. Through all my doubts, all my resistance, all my certainty that I had been right, he had been waiting. My breath hitched, my chest tightening with the weight of emotion. I don't know how to accept this, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't even know who I am anymore. Jesus didn't hesitate. You are mine. The words sent a shudder through me, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. And they were spoken with such authority that my soul couldn't deny them. I have called you by name, he continued, his voice steady, unwavering. You were searching, David, and now you have found what your heart has been longing for all along. Tears blurred my vision. I had been searching, even when I had convinced myself that I had the answers, even when I had silenced my own doubts. Deep down, I had longed for something I couldn't name. And now here he was, the one I had resisted, the one I had dismissed, the one who had loved me all along. I shook my head, the war still raging inside me. But everything I believed, everything I lived for, what happens to all of that? Jesus' expression didn't change. You have not lost the truth, David. You have found its fulfillment. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. But what if I fail? Jesus reached out, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. And in that simple touch, I felt something I had never known before. Assurance. You will fail, he said gently. But I will never let you go. A sob tore through me. I had spent years believing that my place before God depended on me, on my discipline, my obedience, my ability to do enough. But Jesus was telling me that it had never been about what I could do. It had always been about what he had already done. And then the light around us began to shift. I felt it before I saw it. A change in the air, a shift in the very essence of where I was. The warmth of the light remained, but the surroundings transformed. I was no longer just standing in radiance. I was somewhere else. The first thing I noticed was the colors. So vivid, so alive, unlike anything I had ever seen. The sky stretched endlessly, its hues shifting between gold, sapphire, and a depth of blue that seemed to sing rather than just exist. The very air felt alive, filled with a peace so tangible it settled deep into my soul. Then I saw them. People. Countless people, moving freely, their faces alight with joy. It wasn't just happiness. It was something deeper, something more complete than anything I had ever witnessed on earth. They were whole, radiant, at peace in a way that defied human comprehension. This, Jesus said beside me, his voice filled with warmth, is heaven. A gasp escaped my lips. My mind struggled to take it all in. The beauty, the perfection, the life that surrounded me. It was unlike anything I had ever imagined. I had prayed for this, longed for this, spent my entire existence trying to be worthy of this. And yet, I had never understood it until now. I turned to Jesus, my voice shaking. "This is it? This is what we've all been searching for." He nodded. "This is the fulfillment of God's promise. This is what it means to be united with Him." I looked around again, my heart pounding. I could feel the presence of God here, not as a distant entity, not as an unreachable force, but as something real, intimate, near. I had spent my whole life striving. Now, for the first time, I rested. But just as the peace began to settle into my soul, a new awareness stirred inside me. Something wasn't finished yet, and I knew, deep in my spirit, that this journey was far from over. The beauty of heaven was overwhelming. Everywhere I turned, I saw colors more radiant than anything I had ever known. Hues so vibrant they felt alive, pulsating with energy. The air itself carried a presence, something beyond mere atmosphere. A peace so tangible it sank deep into my soul, calming parts of me I hadn't even realized were restless. I took a step forward, half expecting the ground beneath me to be like the earth I had known. But it wasn't. It was firm, yet weightless, as if every step carried me forward without effort. A gentle warmth wrapped around me, not from a sun, for there was no visible source of light. Yet everything was illuminated in a brilliance that defied explanation. People were everywhere, but they weren't just standing idly or wandering without purpose. They were alive in a way that transcended physical existence. I saw them embracing one another, speaking with expressions of pure joy. There was laughter, not the kind forced by small talk, not laughter hiding pain, but genuine, unshakable joy. Some stood in awe, their faces lifted as if drinking in the very presence of God. Others moved freely, completely at peace, as if they had finally found home. I had spent my whole life wondering what heaven would be like. Was it a paradise of endless pleasure? A place where rewards were handed out like trophies? I had envisioned it as a destination, something to be achieved, something distant, something earned. But now I realized heaven wasn't about rewards. It wasn't about a final prize for a life well lived. It was about God. His presence was here, surrounding everything, filling every space, every soul, every breath. There was no striving, no struggle, no sense of inadequacy, no burden of needing to prove oneself. Only belonging, only love. A lump formed in my throat as I turned back to Jesus. "This is real," he smiled. "Yes, David. This is what I have prepared for those who love me." I swallowed hard. "But I never loved you." The admission burned in my chest. "I denied you. I rejected everything about you. I argued against you. How can someone like me stand here in this place?" Jesus' expression didn't change. There was no disappointment, no rebuke, only that deep, unfathomable love. He placed a hand on my shoulder, and instantly, I felt something inside me loosen. The weight of every doubt, every argument, every moment I had spent believing I had to be enough on my own. "You are here," he said gently. "Not because of what you did, not because of how much you prayed, how much you studied, or how many debates you won." His voice softened. "You are here because I loved you first." I trembled. The words unraveled something deep within me, something buried under years of self-sufficiency, of belief in my own righteousness. I had spent my whole life thinking that my destiny depended on me, on my works, my effort, my ability to measure up. But standing here, I realized the truth. It had never been about me at all. Tears blurred my vision, but before I could respond, something changed. The warmth of heaven remained, but I felt a shift, a pull, like a thread being gently tugged in my soul. The light around me flickered, not dimming, but shifting in focus. My breath caught in my throat as my surroundings blurred, morphing into something entirely different. The air grew heavy, thick, oppressive. A cold unlike anything I had ever felt wrapped around me, pressing into my chest. The colors faded into gray, the atmosphere thick with something I couldn't describe, something that sent a chill through the very core of my being. And then I heard it. Cries, wails of anguish, hopelessness woven into sound. I turned in horror, my stomach twisting as I took in the sight before me. Darkness stretched in every direction, vast and consuming. It wasn't the absence of light, it was the absence of life itself. Figures moved within the shadows, their faces contorted with despair, their hands reaching out as though grasping for something, anything, that might free them. I recoiled, my body instinctively stepping back. No, I don't want to see this. But Jesus stood beside me, unmoving. His face was sorrowful yet steady. You need to see, David. I shook my head, my heart hammering against my ribs. I thought this place was for the wicked, the evil ones. But these people, they look like, Jesus finished my thought, like people you have known. A wave of sickness rolled through me. I wanted to deny it, to turn away, to tell myself that this was wrong, that this couldn't be real. But it was. I saw men and women, some I recognized from memories I had long forgotten. Their mouths moved, crying out, but I couldn't hear their words, only their desperation. They weren't screaming from pain, they were screaming from absence. I didn't understand at first. Then, slowly, I felt it, the one thing that made this place different from where I had just been. God was not here. His presence, His love, His light, it was gone. This was separation, and it was worse than any fire, any torment, any suffering I had ever imagined. Tears burned my eyes. My voice was barely a whisper. Why? Jesus' reply came with a sorrow so deep, it nearly broke me. Because they chose separation. The words hit me like a hammer. My mind screamed against them. No one would choose this. Who would ever choose this? Jesus' gaze didn't waver. Many think they don't. But every time they reject my love, they turn toward this instead. This is not a punishment, David. It is the absence of the one thing that gives life. I shook my head. But they're calling out. They want help. They want rescue. Jesus' expression held a grief I couldn't comprehend. They do, but not for me. They want relief, but they do not want me. The truth of his words hit me like a tidal wave. My whole life I had seen faith as a system, rules, obligations, deeds. But it was never about that. It was about a relationship. A love freely given but not forced. And some had chosen to reject it. I turned to Jesus, my heart pounding. Then what do I do? His eyes met mine. You go back. And you tell them. And just like that, I felt the pull again. Only this time I knew exactly where I was going. The moment Jesus spoke those words, I felt a force pull at me. Not harshly, not violently, but with undeniable certainty. My spirit resisted, clinging to the warmth of his presence, the safety of heaven's embrace. I didn't want to leave. How could I? How could I return to the broken world I had left behind after witnessing all of this? Jesus, please. My voice was desperate, trembling. I don't want to go back. I want to stay here with you. His eyes, filled with infinite love, held mine. David, your time here is not finished. A lump formed in my throat. My heart pounded with the weight of what I was about to face. But what if they don't believe me? What if they reject me? He stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. Some will, but some will listen. Some will hear my voice through yours. I swallowed hard, my entire being caught between two realities, the glory of heaven and the call to return. You must tell them, Jesus continued. Tell them what you have seen. Tell them what I have shown you. Tell them that my love is greater than their doubts, their fears, their sins. But they must choose it. The memories of the place I had just seen, the darkness, the absence, the anguish of separation from God, flashed in my mind, sending a shudder through me. I had to go back. I didn't understand how I would do it, or what I would say, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stay silent. The pull intensified. The light around me began to shift, flickering like the final embers of a fire before vanishing into darkness. Then, a sudden, crushing force gripped me, like being dragged through a tunnel at an unimaginable speed. A rush of sound, color, and sensation overwhelmed me, and in the next instant, I gasped. Pain shot through my chest, searing and immediate, like I had been yanked from another realm and slammed back into my body. My lungs burned as I sucked in air, my ears ringing with the sounds of frantic voices. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled my nostrils, the blinding fluorescence of hospital lights piercing my returning consciousness. A voice, loud, disbelieving, cut through the chaos. He's back. He's back. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, foreign, as if they no longer belonged to me. My heart thundered in my chest, the steady beeping of the monitors syncing with its rhythm. Then I saw him, my brother. His face, once frozen in despair, was now filled with shock, relief, overwhelming emotion. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he clutched my hand in his own. "David?" His voice cracked. "Can you hear me?" I blinked, forcing my vision to steady. My lips parted, my throat dry and raw. I had been gone. I knew it. He knew it. The doctors knew it. And yet, here I was, alive. I turned my head slightly, taking in the stunned expressions of the medical team. One doctor shook his head in disbelief. "We lost him." His heart stopped. "And now," he exhaled sharply, "this is impossible." But I knew better. It wasn't impossible. It was a miracle. The weight of what had happened, of what I had seen, what I had learned, pressed down on me like an anchor. My entire world had been shattered and rebuilt in the span of moments. And now I had to face a reality I wasn't sure how to navigate. Because I wasn't the same man who had left this hospital bed. I had stood in the presence of Jesus. I had seen heaven with my own eyes. I had witnessed the torment of those who had rejected him. And I had been sent back. My brother's grip tightened. "David, what happened? What did you see?" The words stuck in my throat. How could I explain it? How could I put into words the enormity of what had just occurred? The weight of what had happened settled deep into my bones, pressing against my chest with an intensity one couldn't shake. My body was here, alive, breathing, but my soul still felt tethered to something far beyond this hospital room. My brother, Mike, sat beside me, his grip still firm around my hand, his eyes searching mine for answers I wasn't sure how to give. "David," his voice was cautious, hesitant. You weren't breathing. Your heart stopped. The doctors said you were gone." I swallowed, my throat dry, my lips cracked. The air felt heavier here, almost suffocating after the purity of what I had just experienced. "I know," I whispered. "I was." His grip tightened. "Then how?" I turned my head slowly, my eyes locking onto his. Jesus. Mike blinked, his brows pulling together. What? I saw him, Mike, I said, my voice stronger now, steadier, though my body still trembled from exhaustion. I saw Jesus. His expression shifted, uncertainty flickering across his face, then skepticism. He exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. David, you've been through a lot. Your brain was deprived of oxygen. Maybe it was a dream, a hallucination. I had expected this. Of course, he would doubt. Hadn't I spent my whole life doing the same thing? Hadn't I, too, dismissed these kinds of stories as fantasy, as delusions, as the wishful thinking of desperate people? But this wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a dream. It was more real than anything I had ever known. I pushed myself up slightly, ignoring the sharp ache in my chest. Mike, listen to me. I wasn't just unconscious. I wasn't just fading in and out. I was gone. I saw my own body. I saw you, standing in the corner, gripping that chair like your life depended on it. I saw the doctors working on me. And then, I took a shaky breath. I left. Mike's eyes widened, his mouth parting slightly, but he said nothing. I pressed on. I was pulled toward something, a light, but not like any light we know. It was alive, Mike. Filled me, surrounded me. And then I saw him. My voice broke slightly as I whispered, I saw Jesus. Mike let out a breath, shaking his head. David, you're not. I didn't believe in him. I cut in, my voice firm, raw with emotion. You know I didn't. I spent my whole life arguing against Christianity, against Jesus being anything more than a prophet. But Mike, I was wrong. Silence stretched between us, heavy, thick. Mike's face was unreadable, torn between disbelief and something else, something deeper. I took a breath, trying to steady myself. I saw heaven, Mike, and I saw hell. His jaw clenched, his hands gripping his knees. Hell? He echoed, his voice barely audible. I nodded slowly. I saw what happens to those who reject him. Not because God sends them there, but because they choose it. They choose separation. And the absence of God is, Mike, it's worse than anything I can put into words. Mike stared at me, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. David, do you hear yourself? You're telling me that in the span of a few minutes you died, you met Jesus, you saw heaven and hell, and now you're back. I held his gaze. Yes. He let out a harsh breath, running a hand over his face. This is insane. I exhaled slowly, my heart aching. Not from the physical pain, but from the weight of knowing how hard this would be for him to accept. How hard it had been for me. I know it sounds that way, I admitted. But Mike, I can't ignore what I saw, and I can't stay silent about it. Jesus sent me back to tell people. To tell you. His eyes darkened with something unreadable, his lips pressing into a tight line. What are you saying? I forced myself to sit up further, ignoring the protests of my body. I'm saying that everything we've believed our whole lives, it's not the whole truth. That salvation isn't about how much we do, how many prayers we say, or how many good deeds we collect. I shook my head. It's about him. It's about accepting what he's already done for us. Mike scoffed, pushing up from his chair, pacing the small hospital room. David, do you have any idea what you're saying? What this means? I nodded. I do. He stopped, turning back to face me. If you go around telling people this, they'll think you've lost your mind. Our family will lose it. The community. He shook his head. You could lose everything. His words hit harder than I wanted to admit. He wasn't wrong. My entire identity had been built on my faith, my background, my community. If I came forward with this, if I told them, I could lose my family, my home, my entire life. I swallowed hard. I know the cost, Mike, but how can I stay silent? How can I pretend I didn't see what I saw? That I didn't meet Jesus himself? My voice cracked as I whispered, how could I ever go back to who I was before? Mike's expression wavered, uncertainty flickering across his face. He wasn't convinced, but he wasn't rejecting me outright either. That was enough for now. I sank back into the pillows, exhaustion finally overtaking me. But as my eyes drifted closed, one thought remained, steady and unwavering. I would tell the truth, no matter what it cost me. The days that followed were a blur of tests, whispered conversations, and the lingering weight of what I had experienced. Physically, I was recovering. The doctors called it a miracle. My heart had stopped, yet here I was, alive. They ran scans, blood tests, every examination they could think of, but none of them could explain why I had come back. But saying it out loud to people who didn't understand? That was another matter entirely. Mike had stayed with me every night since I had woken up. He hadn't spoken much about what I told him, about seeing Jesus, about heaven and hell, but I knew he was thinking about it. I could see it in the way he studied me when he thought I wasn't looking, the way his hands fidgeted when he sat in silence. He was trying to make sense of it the same way I had. And then there was the rest of my family. My parents had arrived the day after I was stabilized, their faces lined with worry and relief. My mother had cried as she held my hand, thanking God that I was still alive. My father stood beside her, his hand firm on my shoulder, nodding in quiet approval. "You're strong, David," he said. "God has given you more time." He didn't know how right he was. I had been given time, but not just to live. I had been given time to tell the truth. But how could I? How could I look into my parents' faces, into the faces of the people who had raised me, who had loved me, and tell them that everything we had believed wasn't the full truth? That Jesus wasn't just a prophet, but the Son of God? That salvation wasn't something we could earn, but something freely given? How could I tell them that I had seen hell, that I had witnessed the torment of souls separated from God? Not because he had condemned them, but because they had chosen to reject him? The thought made my chest tighten. I knew what this would cost me, and yet, I knew I couldn't stay silent. On the third night after I woke up, Mike sat beside me, staring at the floor, his jaw tight. He hadn't mentioned what I had told him since the first night. But now the silence was unbearable. "Mike," I said softly. His head lifted slightly, but he didn't meet my eyes. "I know you don't believe me," I continued. "I know this sounds impossible." He let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know what to believe." I nodded, my throat tightening. "I get it. If this had happened to you and not me, I don't know if I would have believed you either." Mike let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, you would have argued with me until you were blue in the face." I smiled, but it faded quickly. "Mike, I know you think this was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe the drugs they gave me in the hospital, but I know what I saw. I know who I met. And I can't pretend it didn't happen." His fingers tapped against his knee, restless. "So what now?" I hesitated. "I have to tell them." His head snapped up, his eyes wide. "Tell who?" "Our family. Our community." I swallowed hard. "Mike, I was sent back for a reason. If I don't say anything, if I keep this to myself, then what was the point? People need to know." He stared at me, disbelief written across his face. "David, do you understand what you're saying? If you start telling people this, telling them this, you could lose everything." I looked away, my chest tightening. "I know. No, I don't think you do. He leaned forward, his voice low, urgent. They're not just going to shrug this off. Our parents will be devastated. The community, they're going to turn on you, David. They're going to say you've lost your mind. Or worse. I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying myself. I had already thought of all this, but hearing it out loud, hearing it from him, made it more real. I know what it could cost me, I said finally. But Mike, if I stay silent, if I keep this to myself, then what happens to the people who never get the chance to hear the truth? What happens to them? His face darkened, and I knew he was thinking about what I had told him about hell, about separation from God. After a long moment, he let out a slow exhale, rubbing the back of his neck. You're really gonna do this, aren't you? I nodded. Yeah, I am. He stared at me for a beat longer, then shook his head with a disbelieving chuckle. You're either the bravest guy I know, or the dumbest. I smiled. Maybe both. Mike leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. Well, you're gonna need all the help you can get. I frowned. Mike, I'm not saying I believe you, not yet, but you're my brother, and if you're really doing this, I'm not letting you do it alone. The words hit me harder than I expected. My throat tightened, but I nodded. Thank you, I whispered. Mike sighed. You better be right about this, David. I met his gaze, unwavering. I am. And with that, I knew there was no turning back. The weight of what I was about to do settled deep in my chest as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of my hospital room. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, the steady beeping of the monitors the only other sound in the quiet space. But inside, my thoughts were anything but quiet. I was going to tell them. I was going to tell my parents, my family, my community, the people who had shaped me, who had raised me, about what had happened, about what I had seen, about Jesus. I already knew the price. Mike wasn't wrong. This wasn't going to be some minor disagreement, some theological debate over dinner. This was going to change everything. My parents would be devastated. My community would turn against me. I could lose my home, my friends, my entire identity. And yet, as I lay there, fear clawing at the edges of my resolve, I heard it again. The voice that had spoken to me in that place of light, the voice that had called my name, that had told me the truth. Tell them. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. Jesus had sent me back for a reason, and that reason wasn't to stay silent. The next morning, when my parents arrived, I could already sense something had changed. Maybe it was in my face, in my posture, in the way I looked at them. My mother sat beside me, her eyes filled with relief. You look better today, David, she said, squeezing my hand. The doctors say you're getting stronger. I forced a small smile. Yeah, I feel different. She smiled, brushing her fingers over my forehead, the way she used to when I was a child. My father stood at the foot of the bed, his arms crossed, studying me the way he always did when he was trying to read between my words. God has been merciful to you, he said. He has given you another chance. I swallowed hard. He had no idea how true that was. Mike sat quietly in the chair near the window, his expression unreadable. He hadn't said much since our conversation the night before, but he was here. That was enough. I took a breath, steadying myself. Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something. My mother's face softened. Of course, sweetheart. What is it? I glanced at Mike. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. Go on. I turned back to my parents. When my heart stopped, I wasn't just unconscious. I left my body. My father's brows knitted together. My mother's grip on my hand tightened slightly. I saw everything, I continued. I saw myself lying in this bed, I saw Mike standing in the corner. I saw the doctors working on me. And then I was pulled into something else. The room felt smaller, heavier, the air between us thick with tension. I was taken to a place of light, I said, my voice shaking slightly. And I saw him. My mother's eyes widened. You mean? I nodded. Jesus. Silence. A long, unbearable silence. My father's expression hardened. David, no. His voice was firm, final, like he could stop. I pressed forward. I saw him. He called me by name. He knew me. My mother pulled back slightly. Her lips parted in disbelief. David, what are you saying? I felt my throat tighten, but I pushed through it. I'm saying that Jesus is who he says he is. He's not just a prophet. He's the Son of God. And salvation isn't about deeds. It's not about how much we pray or how many good things we do. It's about accepting him. My father took a sharp breath, his hands clenching into fists. Enough, Dad. Enough. His voice was cold, his eyes hard. I will not listen to this. My mother shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. David, this isn't you. This isn't what we raised you to believe. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I know, but it's true. My father stepped forward, his face pale with barely contained anger. You are confused. Your mind has been affected by the trauma, by the medication. You don't know why. I do, I said, my voice steady. Dad, I know this is hard to hear, but I can't deny what I saw. I met him. He sent me back to tell you, to tell everyone. My father's jaw tightened. We are leaving. My mother looked at me, her face torn between love and heartbreak. David, please, don't do this. Don't throw everything away. I felt my own tears threatening to spill over. I'm not throwing anything away. I've been given something I can't ignore. My father turned on his heel. Come, Sarah. My mother hesitated, her eyes locked onto mine, pleading. But then she turned and followed him out the door. And just like that, they were gone. I let out a shaky breath, my chest aching. Not from my body's wounds, but from the loss that had just taken place. A long silence filled the room. Then, a quiet voice. That could have gone worse. I let out a small, humorless laugh, turning toward Mike, who was still sitting in his chair, arms crossed. They'll come around, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. I wiped at my face, my throat tight. I don't know. Mike exhaled, looking at me for a long moment. Then he leaned forward. I don't know if I believe everything you're saying, David, but... He paused, rubbing his jaw. I can't ignore that something happened to you. You're different. I nodded, gripping the hospital blanket tightly in my fists. Because I can't go back to who I was before. Mike studied me, then let out a slow sigh. Then I guess we figure out where you go from here. I took a deep breath, the reality of my new life settling into place. There was no turning back now. There are moments in life that change us forever. Moments where everything we thought we knew is shattered, and we are forced to see the truth with new eyes. My experience was one of those moments. I was a man who prided himself on his faith, on my knowledge, on my devotion to what I believed was right. But in the span of a few moments, when my heart stopped, when I crossed from life to death, I saw what true faith really meant. I met Jesus. I saw heaven. I witnessed hell. And what I learned in that place changed me in ways I never imagined. For so long, I thought salvation was something to be earned, something to achieve through prayers, fasting, and good deeds. But standing in his presence, I realized something I had never understood before. Grace is not something we earn. It is a a gift that Jesus offers to each of us, but one we must choose to accept. I know my story may challenge you. It may raise questions, stir emotions, or even bring doubt, and that's okay. But I encourage you, don't ignore that stirring in your heart. Have you ever had an experience that made you question everything? Have you ever felt a moment where God was trying to speak to you? I would love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. If the story spoke to you, if it made you reflect on faith, eternity, and what it all means, like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear this. You never know how one message, one testimony, can change a life. Jesus changed mine, and he can change yours too. Will you listen?